Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, if you enjoy this podcast and you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share it with them. In 451 AD, on a plain in modern-day France, long forgotten, the Roman general Aetius and his Visigothic allies confronted Attila the Hun at the Battle of Châlons. This battle was one of the most decisive in history. Had Attila broken through that day, the foundations of Western civilization, our cultures, systems, and institutions would never have developed as they did. The victory at Châlons stopped the Huns' expansion into Western Europe, setting the stage for the collapse of Attila's empire just 2 years later. It gave the Germanic tribes space to grow and inherit the legacy of Rome, blending their cultures with Roman law, Roman religion, and Roman tradition. The world that we live in today, which has been shaped by European institutions, languages, and ideas, can trace its roots directly to this single moment. This is how a desperate Roman victory determined the future of Western civilization. Let's now experience the Battle of Châlons.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 81, The Battle of Châlons, the 20th of June, 451. Roman and Visigoth forces, unknown. Hunnish forces, believed to be around 100,000, led by Attila the Hun. The Roman and Visigothic victory over the Huns at the Battle of Châlons in 451 halted Attila's westward expansion and marked the beginning of the end for his empire. While the battle didn't outright destroy Hun power, it shattered their aura of invincibility and forced Attila into retreat. This defeat disrupted their momentum, and 2 years later, in 453, Attila's sudden death plunged the Hun Empire into chaos.
The people the Europeans feared and came to know as the Huns had their roots deep in the heart of Asia. There they were likely the Xiongnu, a name whispered in the annals of Chinese chronicles. Their origins defy certainty, obscured by the passage of time and nomadic myth. But many supposed the Huns were the forerunners of the Mongols, so fierce, so unrelenting that China herself braced against their thunderous raids, erecting the earliest stretches of her Great Wall as a shield. Blocked from expanding into China's richer, settled lands, the Xiongnu turned their gaze west. Over centuries, they moved like an unstoppable tide, driving other peoples before them in waves of displacement and chaos. Peoples of similar blood and lineage likely spread as far as Finland. The barbarian invasions that tore at the fabric of the Roman Empire, those too were driven westward under the crushing pressure of the Xiongnu advance. The Huns spread across an immense and untamed landscape, and wherever they marched, they fought. No tribe was spared. South of the Caucasus, people who answered to the Persian Empire bent to the Huns, defeated and stripped of their pride, their tribute feeding the insatiable appetites of these nomadic conquerors. It was in 375 when these unstoppable horsemen crossed the Don River in modern Russia that they earned their name Huns. Their arrival was like the tightening of a vice. The Alans and the Goths and countless other Eastern European tribes felt their worlds compress under this new and deadly force. From the dying years of the 4th century into the dawn of the 5th, the Huns carved their way across the north of the Danube, pressing ever westward into what is now Germany. Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, endured their raids as though holding its breath against the storm. The Huns were nomadic horsemen, heirs to the Scythians who came before them, and kin in spirit to the Mongols yet to come. They were bound by blood and brotherhood, but they moved in small bands, scattered across the grasslands to give their horses, their very lifeblood, room to feed and to thrive. For centuries, these warriors rode free, following no single ruler, but in the 5th century, that changed. Rua rose to command the united Huns, the first to hold their loyalty as one people. Through the 420s and the 430s, Rua led his newly unified Huns against the Eastern Roman Empire and the fractious tribes of the Balkans. The Goths felt his fury, as did every kingdom and people in his path. Defeat came at a cost. The Eastern Roman Emperor, Theodosius II, bowed to the reality of his losses, sending Rua and his Huns a ransom, 350 pounds of gold each year, a price paid in shame to buy peace. When Rua died in 433, his throne passed to two of his nephews, Bleda and Attila. Together they inherited the weight of a war machine poised to strike. At first the Huns grew quiet, as though coiling for the next strike. That silence broke in 441 when Attila, now the dominant leader, unleashed his forces into southeastern Europe. Cities burned. The countryside lay in ruin. From the Balkans to modern Yugoslavia, devastation was their legacy. A year of uneasy peace followed. Then the Huns struck once more. This time they ignored the great fortresses and marched straight for Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Empire. Theodosius, humbled yet again, was forced to open his coffers even wider. 2,100 pounds of gold, an annual price for their survival, paid to Attila the Hun. But power rarely tolerates division. In 445, Attila ended his brother Bleda's life and assumed sole rule. The Huns now answered to him alone. With no one left to challenge him, Attila turned his gaze westward. Attila moved quickly to secure his eastern flank with another campaign against Constantinople, a strike so decisive it silenced the frontier for the time being. With his rear safe, he turned his full attention west, to Gaul and the rich Italian heartland. The West was a fractured and weary world. Valentinian III, emperor of what little remained of Rome's Western Empire, teetered on all sides. Gaiseric, the Vandal king, ravaged North Africa. Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, ruled southern Gaul with his own ambitions. Rome was caught between wolves, too weakened to fight them all at once. Theodoric's blood boiled for vengeance. Gaiseric had taken his daughter as a bride, only to send her back maimed, a gesture of pure insult. The hostility between the Vandals and the Visigoths crackled like dry timber, ready to burn. By 450, Attila sharpened his strategy. He would exploit the divisions of his enemies, pitting them against one another until they bled themselves dry. Then he would fall upon them one by one. Attila also had his pretext for war, neatly wrapped in imperial scandal. Years before, Honoria, the sister of Valentinian III, had sent Attila a plea for help, a desperate act of rebellion against her brother. Now Attila claimed that this plea was a marriage proposal, and with it he demanded half of the Western Roman Empire as his dowry. For Attila, it was no mere letter. It was a contract, a bond of marriage entitling him to half the empire. He proclaimed it boldly, knowing the absurdity of his claim mattered less than the power it gave him to march westward with righteous fury. Fate handed Attila yet another opening. In northern Gaul, the Ripuarian Franks squabbled over succession. One claimant turned to Attila for aid, the other to Aetius, Rome's last great general. The rivalries of men, as always, became the fuel for war. For 30 years, Aetius had fought to hold Gaul together, waging war against the tides of tribes sweeping through the region. But Aetius was no stranger to the Huns. In his youth, he had lived among them at Rua's court. He knew their tactics, their way of war, and perhaps even their leader, Attila. Attila may have hoped that Aetius, once a companion, would not stand in his way, but Aetius had sworn his support to one of the Frankish claimants, and with that, Attila had his excuse to march. In 451, a new message arrived from Constantinople. The new emperor, Marcian, declared he would pay no more gold to the Huns. The tribute was done. Attila's response was swift and uncompromising. He sent delegations to Marcian in Constantinople and to Valentinian in Ravenna, demanding his gold from one and Honoria from the other. He made it clear they would yield, or he would take what he was owed by fire and steel. But Attila was a tactician. The Rhine lay open, and one of the Frankish claimants had welcomed him as an ally. Marcian could wait. First, Attila would strike west. Attila's horde swelled with the conquered tribes of northern Europe, men eager to fight or too broken to resist his call. How many warriors marched beneath his banners? The chroniclers spoke of hundreds of thousands. Modern minds suspect fewer, but still it was a force that no power in the West could ignore. Contemporary accounts inflated their numbers to 500,000, a terrifying image of an unstoppable tide. Yet, sober historians argue it was closer to 100,000. Still, that was enough. In the spring of 451, Attila's war machine crossed the Rhine, spreading out like a shadow over the land. His left flank pushed along the Mosel River, moving towards Metz. His center drove straight toward Paris and Orléans. To the north, his right wing swept towards Arras. No city, no village, no blade of grass was left untouched by the fire they carried. They scorched the earth behind them, burning cities, shattering walls, and leaving nothing but ash where once there had been life. Legend tells us that Paris was spared. A young girl named Genevieve, moved by divine inspiration, rallied the terrified citizens to prayer and to defiance. Later, she would be known as Saint Genevieve, the savior of the city. By May, Attila's army reached Orléans and encircled it. Sangiban, king of the Alans, bitter and beaten since his defeat by Aetius years before, had pledged the city to Attila. His word, however, was a fickle thing, bought and sold on shifting tides of fear. Aetius, hearing of the treachery, wasted no time. The general marched for Orléans, his ragtag force cobbled together, yet driven with purpose. Orléans could not fall, not while he still drew breath. Yet Aetius faced a crippling weakness. He had no army. For 30 years, his campaigns in Gaul had leaned heavily on mercenaries, many of them Huns themselves. Now those same horsemen rode under Attila's banners, and Aetius stood alone. Deserted by old allies, Aetius scraped together what forces he could. Every promise, every bribe, every scrap of influence was thrown into the fire to forge an army capable of standing against Attila. In desperation, Aetius turned to Theodoric, king of the Visigoths. Rome and the Visigoths were natural rivals, enemies of old, but war changes alliances. Even Theodoric could see the truth. Attila was the greater enemy. He joined Aetius, and together they marched to Orléans. Reluctantly, Sangiban and his Alans were folded into their ranks. He held no love for Aetius nor loyalty to Rome, but the chance to reach Attila had passed. Now he fought alongside those he once despised. Gregory of Tours, the chronicler of the Franks, tells us that Anianus, the bishop of Orléans, sent a desperate message to Aetius. The city, he warned, could not hold past the 14th of June. The 14th arrived, and Orléans stood on the edge of annihilation. The Huns, relentless, battered a breach into the city's walls. But then, on the horizon, lookouts cried out as they saw Aetius' banners. The Roman general had arrived. Attila's siege crumbled. He withdrew, retreating northward with measured discipline, pulling his distant wings back to form a solid front. This was no rout. It was a hunter repositioning for the next strike. At the Seine, Attila left the Gepids behind his rearguard. It was a calculated sacrifice. That night, Aetius descended upon them. Reports say all 15,000 Gepids were slaughtered or broken. The cost of buying time for Attila's retreat was steep. Attila regrouped on a broad and open plain, his right flank anchored against the Marne River, a battlefield chosen with deliberate care. The exact location is lost to time, but the sources speak of the Catalonian Plain, a vast expanse of earth somewhere in the Champagne region of France. Picture a triangle, bounded by Troyes, Marais-sur-Seine, and Arcis, with Châlons-sur-Marne as its anchor. Here the greatest battle of its age was about to unfold. Attila arranged his forces with the precision of a master tactician. His Huns formed the center, his core, his hammer. To his left stood the Ostrogoths, led by Walomir. On his right, the Gepids and allied tribes commanded by Ardaric, a wall of warriors, ready to crush their enemies. Aetius countered with his own cunning. On the right, Theodoric and his Visigoths faced their Ostrogothic brethren, kin turned enemy for the day. Aetius himself held the left flank, a patchwork force of Franks, Burgundians, and every tribe he could muster. In the center, Aetius placed Sangiban and the Alans. It was a gamble. Sangiban was unreliable, his loyalties murky, but by wedging him between the Romans and the Visigoths, Aetius ensured he would fight, if only to survive. The date of the battle has also slipped through history's grasp. Some claim it was fought on June 20th, others push it as late as September the 27th. What matters is that on that day, blood would soak the Catalonian earth. As dawn broke, the first blows were struck. The Visigoths, led by Theodoric's son, Thorismund, wrestled a small but crucial hill from Attila's left flank. The hill was inconsequential in size, but priceless in advantage. Control of the high ground would shape the slaughter to come. Seeing his left flank waver, Attila acted. He sent troops from his center to support the Ostrogoths, stabilizing his line. Then as the sun reached its zenith, he gave the order. The Huns in the center surged forward, crashing into the Alans with all the fury they could muster. The Alans, to their credit, did not break. Under the crushing weight of the Hun onslaught, they withdrew slowly, bloodied but unbowed, fighting for every step they gained. On the left, Aetius struggled against the Gepids. The line held, but it would not break through. Yet on the Roman right, Theodoric and his Visigoths turned the tide. They shattered the Ostrogoths and wheeled inward like a blade, cutting into Attila's center. The Hun warlord now found his flanks isolated, his forces beginning to fray under the strain. Attila, a commander who knew when to press and when to pull back, saw the growing peril. His flanks were buckling and the center risked collapse. He ordered his forces to withdraw to the safety of their camp, his archers covering their retreat as the sun fell low. By nightfall, the battle was over, but not the war. The Huns regrouped in their camp, forming a formidable defensive position. Attila's archers, masters of their craft, unleashed a storm of arrows that shattered any attempt at pursuit. Aetius, despite the victory on the field, could not breach the camp. As night settled over the blood-soaked plain, confusion reigned. Soldiers from Aetius's army wandered aimlessly, their exhaustion matched only by their disorientation. In the dark, no man could tell friend from foe. With the dawn came clarity and horror. The battlefield lay strewn with the dead, an ocean of shattered bodies and broken weapons. Neither side moved. The living stared across the plain and saw only ruin. The appetite for slaughter sated for the moment. That morning, Thorismund discovered the cost of their victory. Theodoric, his father and king, lay among the fallen. Grief gave way to duty. The Visigoths proclaimed Thorismund their new king, and he accepted the crown as the burden it was. Thorismund and Aetius, united in purpose but wary of Attila's remaining strength, chose caution. Instead of pressing an attack against the fortified Hun camp, they prepared to lay siege. From the Hun camp, shouts and movements hinted at a renewed attack, but these were mere feints, empty gestures to unnerve the Romans and the Visigoths. The truth was clear. Attila's forces had bled heavily, and he had no intention of reopening the battle. The numbers are a mystery, as with much in war. Chroniclers claim staggering casualties, 165,000 men, perhaps even 300,000. But such figures would swallow the army's whole. The true toll is lost, though surely the dead were beyond counting. Though the siege began, Aetius began to see the dangers lurking ahead. A victory too complete might turn his allies into rivals. The Huns were broken, their momentum shattered. But Aetius was no fool. Thorismund, newly crowned and riding the wave of victory, was now the greater threat. Thinking fast, Aetius whispered prudence into Thorismund's ear. "Return home," he urged, "before your brothers take your crown in your absence." Thorismund, proud and eager to secure his throne, agreed. With Thorismund's departure, the siege began to unravel. A gap appeared, and with it, opportunity. Attila saw the gap, but hesitated. A trap? Perhaps. Caution served him well, and he chose instead to withdraw, exploiting his enemy's indecision to escape across the Rhine. Attila's retreat was swift and orderly, his forces vanishing across the Rhine like a shadow into the twilight. Aetius did not follow. He had won enough for one campaign. Some whisper of darker dealings. The historian J.F.C. Fuller dares to propose that Aetius and Attila met under the cover of night after the battle. Two great commanders, both pragmatic, might have struck a secret accord, an agreement to spare their battered armies and live to fight another day. Attila had tasted defeat, but his spirit was unbroken. Châlons had stung, yes, but it had not shattered him. The warlord's ambition still burned. The next year, in 452, Attila returned, not as a broken man, but as a storm reforged. Once again, he demanded Honoria as his bride. This time, he would not ask, he would take. With that as his pretext, the Huns swept into the Italian peninsula. From the Alps, the Hun army poured southward, a force of nature loosed upon the land. Again, cities burned, fields blackened, and the devastation rivaled anything they had inflicted on Gaul the year before. Aetius, for all his brilliance, found himself powerless. He could not muster a force strong enough to face Attila again. Valentinian, the Western emperor, fled Ravenna, retreating to Rome. There was no one left to stop Attila's advance. With no army to meet him in the field, Valentinian resorted to the only option left: negotiation. Valentinian turned to the church. Pope Leo I, the Bishop of Rome, was sent to confront the Hun warlord. The two men, one bearing the weight of the cross, the other carrying the fury of 1,000 armies, met at the Mincio River. No record survives of their words that day. Whatever passed between Attila and Pope Leo, it changed the course of history. The warlord who had razed cities and toppled kingdoms turned his army around and marched out of Italy. Likely, the Pope's words were aided by cold reality. Disease had spread through the ravaged land. There was no fodder left for Attila's horses, no spoils to feed his men. Even the mightiest armies starve when the earth itself has been reduced to ash. Worse yet, word reached Attila of Marcian's move to strike at his capital in the east. Pressed from every side, the great Hun turned away. Italy was left smoldering, but it was spared total destruction. The defeat at Châlons had left its mark. Attila's invasion of Italy lacked the strength, the force, and the ruthless precision he had planned. His withdrawal was not a surrender, but a recognition of limits he could no longer ignore. Attila's story, however, ended not on the battlefield, but in his bed. In 453, even as he planned new campaigns, death claimed him. The scourge of God, as they called him, was gone. Attila's empire, built through fire and blood, did not outlive him. His sons, weak where their father was strong, tore it apart with infighting, squandering the legacy he had forged. The subject tribes rose, tasting freedom once more. At the river Nidau in 454, its location long forgotten, the Gepids delivered a crushing blow to the Huns. The empire that Attila had held together with iron and terror now unraveled. Within 2 generations, the mighty Huns were no longer conquerors, but remnants, scattered and diminished. In the region that would bear their name, Hungary, they remained, but no longer were feared. The Battle of Châlons was more than just a clash of armies, it was a turning point. By halting Attila's advance, Aetius and his allies ensured that the Huns would not claim dominion over Western Europe. Aetius' army was improvised, a force thrown together in haste and desperation. Had they failed that day, there would have been no second chance. No other power in the West could have stood against Attila. Though Rome's survival was temporary, its final collapse inevitable, the victory preserved something greater: the Germanic peoples. Their culture, once dismissed as barbaric, would come to shape Europe long after Rome's imperial banners fell. Germanic society outlasted Rome, carrying its own traditions into the Middle Ages. They adapted Latin ideas, laws, language, and customs, molding them to their own purposes rather than being consumed by the ruins of Rome. Attila's defeat also secured another victor: the Roman Catholic Church. The Church emerged as not only a spiritual force, but as the political authority in Europe. To the Europeans, Attila was the scourge of God, sent to punish them for their sins. Yet his true banishment came not from Aetius' sword, but from Pope Leo's intervention. From this moment, the papacy's power, both spiritual and temporal, began its ascent. Europe now looked to Rome not only for salvation, but for leadership. Who were the saviors of Paris and Orleans? Not just warriors, but people who prayed for deliverance and saw their salvation come. In the end, the Church emerged as Europe's great savior, its power unchallenged for centuries, until a monk named Martin Luther dared defy it in the 16th century.